Well, welcome in LSU fans to the Go 24/7 podcast. My name is Bryce Koon alongside Glen West, where things are picking up not only around the site but also around the LSU campus as well. Spring in full swing, I should say, as SEC baseball awaits us this weekend. Spring football kicked off last Saturday. The first media availability was today, Glenn, on Wednesday, and then obviously the recruiting visit season in full swing as well. So, Glenn, did you enjoy being getting a little more into the swing of things? I know January, February always kind of like the doldrums. You got some baseball you get excited for you, but it's non-conference. The basketball team's not giving us a lot to really talk about. So, how did it feel to kind of be back out there on the practice field, or I should say above the practice field, and observe the first version of the 2025 LSU Tigers?
Yeah, a little bit of a different angle this year for us. They got us up on this. For those who don't know, there's a new part of the facility there where there's a kind of a players' lounge, kind of on the second floor, and there's a way to get up to it from kind of the ground level there. And so they brought the media up to that level, and that's where I think we're going to be watching for the next several weeks at least for spring practice. And it's a different view for sure. I think you get kind of more of a over kind of a landscape view of everything. You can kind of just look at, dip your head into 3 or 4 different position groups at a time, as opposed to just doing it one at a time. But you can centralize your focus as well. And certainly for me today, one of the bigger ones that I was going to be looking at was defensive tackle, and just kind of how Kyle Williams was dealing with the first couple days of being the new D line coach. And before they kind of look, they brought us up to that level, and we're still a few minutes away from them kind of coming from the indoor facility to the outdoor fields. And two of the first people that I saw walking out were Blake Baker and Kyle Williams. They were kind of walking next to each other, and Baker was talking a little bit about maybe where positioning, where positions were, and kind of that he's so early. Kyle Williams is so early here into his tenure that they
Mhm.
probably haven't had too many practices yet. So it's just getting a lay of the land of kind of how they go from one drill to another, that kind of thing. And having even just that little conversation there, and just being able to see that from a distance, I think it just shows that it sounds like a lot of these defensive coaches and this coaching staff as a whole is really welcoming him and trying to get him caught up to speed as quick as possible, because that was something that Brian Kelly talked about, like from a recruiting perspective and certainly from a relationship building perspective. He's got to hit the ground running here in the spring. Like there's no days to just kind of fit in and see and sit and watch and kind of figure out what it is that he needs to do his job. Like he's got to hit this thing with the ground running, and it looked like they were doing that today. They went out and they had a couple individual periods that we were able to watch, and from at least a defensive tackle perspective, it was a lot of leverage drills, a lot of arm leverage. And there was one point where Kyle Williams took Ahmad Bro aside and was showing him how to kind of help him one drill, and kind of have his arm angle a little bit different than maybe he was doing in the drills. So just getting to see the technique side of things, getting to see him kind of out there and teaching those guys, I thought was important to go out there and see for only a 20-minute session. So you got to kind of centralize your focus there in that respect. So I spent a good amount of time looking at that. And then from an offensive perspective, the O-line was pretty consistent
Mhm.
in terms of the first team. That was another thing that Brian Kelly told us. We're so early into this thing that you take everything with a grain of salt at this point in camp. And so it was Tyree Adams at left tackle. I believe it was DJ Tester at center. It was Paul Mubanga at guard. Right tackle was Weston Davis, and I believe the other guard spot was Bo Bordelon. So Bo Bordelon was at right guard, and then Paul Mubanga was at left guard next to Adams. So those were the five in that starting unit. As far as the position player side and the skill set guys, it was Chris Hilton, it was Aaron Anderson, it was Trey'Dez Green, Xavion Thomas, Caden Durham were all out there in the first team with Nussmeier, and those are the returning core guys. So that they're going to be
Yeah.
out there first. And the one thing we didn't see was Nick Anderson in terms of him actually out there in the middle of drills and doing drill work. He's obviously coming from a situation in Oklahoma where he lost a good portion of his season last year to a major injury. So not sure if they're still working out some kinks there with him. settling him into spring camp. But he had his pads on. He was out there, with the receivers and just kind of watching off to the side, but didn't really partake, at least in the portion of practice that we got to see. That doesn't mean that he didn't do anything else throughout the rest of practice, but the 20 minutes or so that we were out there, he did not do very much. So those are just a couple of the key notes, takeaways that I had from day one. I think it's going to be very interesting. I didn't get a good look at the secondary today. We got 3 or 4 more weeks to get a good dive into this team and get a good view of kind of what we can expect going into the spring and fall months, or the summer and fall months, I should say. But some good early learning points, I guess, from some of these position groups today.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about, right? It creates content for us to be
Yeah.
able to kind of talk about and put on the message boards. But I do like what you said. You take the especially the starters with a grain of salt on the offensive line, Glenn. And I know that's something that you and I've kind of talked about where, there's a lot of intrigue around safety, defensive back in general, defensive line, but the offensive line having to replace a couple of players and not when I say a couple, four, guys, and one guy that's probably going to be taken within the top 10 to 15 picks, exclusively. It does beg a nice little question of what that's going to look like. I wanted to get your thoughts on Kelly's response about the um, maybe not the availability, but just what he's thought about in terms of Braylon Moore. We obviously, we kind of knew this, but it was obviously confirmed today that Josh Thompson is on a quarter system up at Northwestern, so they're going to be finishing up school, and I believe he said he's going to be here next week, so he's really not even missing a big chunk of this. What was just your kind of sense? You were in the room there about how Kelly feels about this offensive line, because he talked about, hey, there's a competition. There's a lot of guys. You and I have been talking about this for the past 3 months. What was your sense of just how he feels about it, and how much do you like them just rotating in a lot of guys and kind of finding that combination here early in the spring?
Yeah, it really doesn't feel any different than the first year that Kelly got the job in that first spring there when they had a freshman Will Campbell. They had transfer uh, uh, a transfer in Miles Frazier coming in from FAU. They had a young up and coming player in Garrett Dellinger. They just hadn't gotten onto the field yet early in his career because of injury. So Emory Jones was a summer enrollee that year, so he wasn't even on campus that spring, and he ended up being your starting right tackle for the next 3 years. So, there's still so much that we have to learn about this offensive line, but I do think Kelly believes that he has the right pieces here. We'll see kind of what that looks like going into, the rest of this spring. But I think what you saw today was pretty characteristic of what you saw back in 2022 when they were kind of hashing things out. The guys that were around the program for a little bit, they were the ones that kind of were trotted out there in the first team, and it wasn't what came to be. Braylon
Yeah.
Moore was the second team center today. I don't expect that to be the case when LSU lines up against Clemson in the fall. Josh Thompson will be here probably in the next week to 10 days. I would imagine that he plays a good bit at guard and probably a little bit at right tackle, but he probably won't start on the first team when he first gets here. That's just not how it's going to go. He's going to have to, earn his spot and build up from that point. And I think he's certainly going to be in that mix, come fall. So it's just going to take some time for some of these guys to just kind of learn the offense. And I think maybe that's probably the biggest thing. It's just getting these guys used to the offense, used to the play calling, used to the rhythm and the timing of which they do things, and certainly getting as much work as they can with Garrett Nussmeier and a lot of these other fellow offensive linemen that have been here. So that's all going to be really important. And I do think there are going to be a couple of young players that continue to assert themselves. I mean, Carius Kern was the starting left tackle today, or not the starting left. He was the second team left tackle, which I thought was really interesting. The fact that they have a freshman, a true freshman already in there, getting left tackle reps seems very reminiscent of what happened with Campbell this time 3 years ago. I'm not saying Carius Kern is going to be Will Campbell. I'm just saying that Will Campbell was in that mix very, very early in his career at LSU. And certainly Brian Kelly and Brad Davis are not afraid to throw true freshmen into the fire here, as they've shown over those previous couple of years. So I do think from a position standpoint, offensive line is probably the one that you're going to see the most mixing and matching. I think that was something that Brian Kelly said today as well, that the lineup you see today won't be the same as what you'll see on Friday, which won't be what you see on Saturday, and they're just going to continue rotating guys in and out. I think until they think they have kind of an idea of what they want to do structure wise going into the summer and fall.
It's going to be a spring full of install, a spring full of comfortability, and Brian Kelly kind of hinted at this in his press conference today, talking about over the previous 7 weeks, you've gone through winter workouts. We call them, and I think every program kind of calls them, maybe different things. But you go through mat drills, you go through all this kind of stuff, and when you look and kind of see, Glenn, that's when you build your foundation, and you are in, the film room. You're in kind of these meetings in terms of, this is what it's going to look like. But this is the application portion. And, like what you said, getting guys up to speed, making sure that application is fine tuned. So you're not having to do a ton of that work during fall camp. And
Yeah.
that's kind of where you want to sit it, because we all know you have limited opportunities in the summer as
Yeah.
well.
And then this time in the spring, it's meant for mixing and matching at different positions. Like it's meant for
Yeah.
cross training. It's meant. I mean, this time last spring, Sage Ryan was at cornerback, and he ended up being one of your deep safeties last year. I mean, like there were a number of guys that were playing different positions. Juwan Johnson was a nickel in spring last year. Now he's playing quarterback. So like, there's a lot of transition that happens even over the course of these next few weeks here, where we'll see guys like the one question that we didn't get to today that I had that I think we just got cut off for timing a little bit was I was going to ask about Mansur Delane. Does he not only get reps at cornerback like he was today, but are they going to move him to safety a little bit and cross train him there for some reps if they feel like they need some extra help back there at safety? So there's all kinds of different avenues this can go over the next several weeks in terms of guys playing different positions in certain spots within a position room. So I'm very curious to see how it all lays out.
You almost segued perfectly there without knowing where I was going next, and that's just because great minds think alike there, Glenn. You talked about the secondary, and obviously some of the reports coming out today that Javian Toviano, a name that I think a lot of LSU fans were hoping they could see do some things this spring. Obviously had some, potential off the field things happen last year, and then I think it's just been a guy that you always felt like had some really great potential, but really and truly hasn't been able to consistently be out there. You go back to his freshman season, was probably put in a tough situation playing cornerback 1, cornerback 2, down the stretch of the season. What were your thoughts on seeing him out there, obviously along, with Tamarcus Cooley? And just as a guy that I feel like, we've talked a lot about Deshaun Spears, we've talked a lot about Cooley, Mansur Delane, and guys that could play the safety spot, but Toviano is one of the guys, Glenn, that stayed. Like
Yeah.
the other guys left. Jordan Allen left. Some other safeties. They said we're going to move on. Toviano stayed, and maybe we haven't talked about him as much. I know it's just one day, but just kind of your thoughts on seeing him out there and maybe reminding LSU fans that, hey, superb athlete, was highly recruited, and obviously, you hope to see he still has an opportunity to prove that.
Yeah, Toviano was another guy that came in as a true freshman a couple of years ago and bounced around from corner to nickel to safety, and he's finally found a spot there in the deep part of the field. I'd be lying to say if I watched him a ton today. Like I had my eyes on the safety room and just kind of the guys that were in each section of the individual drills. You know how they kind of split them up, and it's corners are in one part, and then safeties, and then they got nickels and stars in other spots. So Toviano was running with the safeties. It was him and Cooley, and another kind of side note, Jordan Gilbert was kind of off to the side, training with Harold Perkins. He wasn't even dressed out for a practice today. That was another thing that we didn't get Brian Kelly to address today, with what kind of his status is for the rest of spring and what that might look like. But in terms of JV and Toviano, like he's one of those returners that I think from an internal development standpoint, like you need him to get developed. Like he needs to be a guy that you can count on this offseason to really take that next step and to be a contributor for this team, because unlike the cornerback spot, they didn't make a whole ton of changes at safety. I mean, they lost
Yeah.
guys. They brought in Tamarcus Cooley from NC State. I think eventually he slides into nickel. He'll probably play a little bit of safety as well, but there'll be some mixing and matching with him. But they really need these young guys in Toviano, and Toviano's not even really a young guy now. He's going into his third year.
Yeah.
That they need Toviano, they need Deshaun Spears, they need those two guys in particular to really take that next step as players. And I think now that they have a centralized focus on Toviano, it should really help him in his development, because for so much of his first couple of years there, he was bouncing around all over the field, just trying to find ways in which he can slip into the rotation. And now he seems pretty solidified at that deep safety spot, whether it's free or strong safety. We don't know yet, but I think he's somebody that has the physical tools to do it, and now it's just about coaching up the technique and making getting some more playmaking out of that position as well.
Yeah, no, I like what you said there. It's the tools. Toviano's pretty toolsy. Like he's a guy that has what you want to see, what you'd like to see on the back end of your defense as well. So
Yeah.
spring ball going to keep obviously rolling along. Just day one. Shout out to my man Glen for putting together 500 plus words in a 20-minute viewing period for all of you.
There
And you
was
can go check that out there as
there was a
well.
lot to see in 20 minutes. What can I say? But we won't be getting those kinds of deep dives, I don't think, with those other 20-minute sessions. We'll get a couple more full practices, but it's going to be hard to squeeze 500 words, I think, out of every 20-minute session this spring without it feeling like overkill. So,
And
um,
just for folks that maybe don't know, because I know we had a couple questions about this on our Ask Us Anything. They said, we hadn't seen anything. The availability portion this was the first one. So yes, LSU has been practicing since last Saturday. You remember you only get a finite number of practices, but the Tigers will be back out there, and we'll obviously get a chance to see them on Friday morning. So we'll have some reports there, and then Saturday, which is where you're going to be an opportunity to get some video and photos that first 20 minutes. But Glenn, really, our first kind of opening it all up and seeing it was we get to kind of watch the full practice. So make sure you check in this weekend, which is going to be a crazy busy weekend here on LSU's campus as we get our first look at the Tigers in terms of the full hour, 2 hours. And then on Friday, too, we get to talk with some players post practice. And then on Saturday, it's Brian Kelly once again before we roll into, I guess, the official week 2 of the media portion of spring practice. And then, it's I think spring football, Glenn, to kind of wrap up this portion of the show. Spring football is at a sense of excitement. I'm a baseball guy, so it's like spring training. It's a clean slate. Everyone feels like they got a good shot. No one's paying attention, or hopefully not, to the early odds makers and what they're saying, the way too early projections, stuff like that. But everyone feels like they got a clean slate, ready to go, and you want to install, you want to get some things ironed out. And really, in today's day and age, Glenn, and maybe you can offer some thoughts on this before we move on to the recruiting portion. You also have to kind of figure out what you have and what you don't have, because that spring portal is going to open up, and I think it's interesting to see. And I don't even know how LSU would look at it, but just in terms of like if some things don't, and Kelly did mention it, like there's been nobody to this point that is like, oh gosh, that was a big miss. And truthfully, I mean, every guy looks good in shorts and a t-shirt at the Division I SEC level. So I
yeah,
don't know how much you could really
they're
take,
all
but just
great athletes for
they're all
sure.
great athletes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's another interesting angle that obviously we'll see what happens, but it's just maybe from the time you started covering LSU, it's changed spring football a little bit in the terms of how you approach it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this time last year we had a glaring weakness that we knew LSU needed to address after the spring, which was the defensive tackle room. And they went out and they got JVR Suggs, and they kind of try to duct tape it, I think, with that strategy. And but this year, I think they're not in a position where they need guys. I mean, like I think you could certainly make easy arguments for a couple spots. Like I would say safety would be one. If
Mm-hmm.
there's the right safety that hops in the portal, maybe you go out and you be aggressive and try to get him. I would say probably a defensive tackle too. I mean, like I think they could use some help on that interior D line, just kind of add another body in there. And if there's any attrition, like I'm not saying there's going to be attrition, but when you do make a position coach change, I mean, some of these guys do come to LSU for that position coach. And, that's not exactly the way that Brian Kelly wants things to be, but it is kind of the reality of kind of what goes in or what factors into some of their decisions on top of the financial and the NIL, of course, which is, become kind of A1, I think, for a lot of these guys. So it's going to be
Mm-hmm.
really interesting to see kind of what they look at. I mean, I think you could also make an easy argument for quarterback if there's the right guy that just isn't feeling it in the spring with his team and wants to go elsewhere. Maybe you bring in some more help for the quarterback spot, maybe a more veteran arm or something like that. But those are decisions that'll be made, I think, as LSU learns, like you mentioned, what they have on that side on both sides of the ball, and just kind of what guys are feeling leaving the spring about where they are in the pecking order, and if it's a situation they want to be a part of.
Yeah, no, it's creates different intrigue around spring football. That is for sure. Well, Glenn, obviously, folks on Go 24/7 know that it's also a time, and we're continuing to update that list where LSU is going to be inviting some of the top 2026 and 2027 recruits on campus to get a look at some of the new faces on the staff. And obviously, when coaches went and visited back in the month of January, then you had the dead period, and then you kind of get to get onto campus. And I think it's an intriguing time too, because for a lot of these kids, this is the perfect time to get your spring visit in, and then to really solidify, is that the place I want to use one of my OVs to? And that's kind of where LSU is in the boat with a lot of 2026 kids. And I think it kind of started this past weekend, obviously, with the Under Armour New Orleans camp, where, we had the chance to, see pretty much what we've been talking about for a couple of years at this point, Glenn. Like, this 2026 defensive line class, LSU needed to clean up pretty well in that class as best as they can. We obviously saw a bunch of those names: Darius McKinley, Richard Anderson, who I think is every fan should be every bit as excited to watch what he can do at the next level, just his mentality and what he can do on the football field. Then obviously, have a guy in Dylan Berryman, whose recruitment is I'll say up in the air, kind of an interesting recruitment with the coaching change. And then obviously Lamar Brown right there next door, who just recently named his top 4 and will be taking one of those OVs to LSU and getting the last one there. But, Glenn, it's a week where you're going to have some big time prospects. This upcoming weekend, I'll be down in New Orleans for the Battle 7-on-7 tournament, where there will be a lot of targets that will essentially play in the 7-on-7, and the Tigers are hoping to get a lot of those guys on campus in the weekend. Maybe they get a quick drive up after one of their games or something like that towards the end on Saturday afternoon or Sunday, so they can get them in the building, talk with them, and do the whole, I'll say, the schmoozing that recruiting is nowadays. But I think it's an interesting time of the year. And I got off the phone with a kid that visited this past, yesterday, Jamar Owens, the defensive back out of Georgia, who made his way to campus. Booby Feaster, I love saying that name on a podcast and not getting flagged for it. Booby Feaster making his way to campus this week. And then obviously, Glenn, it's a loaded weekend where I think it's an intriguing time. We're going to get to hear a lot of thoughts on some of the new coaches: Kyle Williams, Alex Atkins handing out some offers in that tight end room. But just your perspective on what recruiting this time of the year means, because I think, and I kind of already said, I think this is just a time where you obviously take things with a grain of salt, and LSU fans are definitely going to do that after the fiasco that was last season. But I think one thing you can kind of take away is when we talk to these kids, the interest level of getting back for the official visit. Like, that's kind of the big thing you want to nail down. And so if there's talks about, hey, we've scheduled it or we're working to schedule it, you can kind of start to, if you're a fan at home and you like to do this kind of stuff, make a big board of, okay, here's who LSU really, really would like to get in that 2026 class.
Yeah, for sure. I think you laid it out there really nicely. I mean, these next couple of weeks in particular, where they're having spring practices and they're able to show these recruits kind of what a typical day looks like around LSU in the middle of a practice season, or a potential regular season later down the line. I think all that stuff is valuable information for these recruits. And but look, I don't think we should sugarcoat this either. Like, they also want to know kind of what the deal is for them, like what's in it for them financially, and kind of I would imagine they start having those conversations at this time of the year as well. I mean, won't mention it, but there's recruits out there that will come in and talk about those things, and I know that's happened here recently for LSU. So there's a lot of ways in which you've got to be able to have your P's and Q's in a row about each individual recruit. Making sure the coaches are on top of, calling all of them, and making sure that they're feeling like they're a part of the plans and a part of the process of recruiting. I think all that still exists, but there is that underlying theme here of just kind of, what can you do for me? And these are good opportunities to get those guys all in the same building at the same time. You mentioned the Battle of New Orleans deal. There's going to be a lot of Louisiana teams down there
Yeah.
at that event, and at least historically, when I've gone to those things in the last several years, they always make those bus trips up to Baton Rouge as
Yeah.
teams, and so I'm sure they'll have even a lot more kids on campus this week than we might even be able to get our hands on by Friday or Saturday of this weekend, just because a lot of this stuff can be done last minute because it's just an hour up the road. And if you have 5 hours between games, or if you're finished with your games early in the morning, you can go spend an afternoon up in Baton Rouge, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
LSU is going to be very receptive to all that stuff, and I think they have a good idea and a good plan of what they want to do for this weekend. But I did want to ask you, just, I mean, you were around a lot of these guys last weekend. Do you get the sense that this is a program in LSU that is kind of taking those next steps, and that they are they're being competitive, and they are making sure that a lot of these guys in and around the state that they have that are top targets, you mentioned some of them there, that they have legit chance at making those moves, and that those prospects are hearing what they have to say?
Yeah, I think, and specifically talking with the defensive line targets, I mean, the questions surrounded around Kyle Williams, hey, Bo Davis is gone. And I think Richard Anderson had probably the most candid and, Glenn, we talked to a lot of different recruits. Some guys are more willing to expound upon their answers than others. And Richard Anderson was a great interview. And I've got a piece solely on him that I'm writing just about his history and his background. But he talked about it. He said, look, I can't hate the fact that Bo Davis left, because although it sucks and would love to have been coached by Bo Davis, he's got to do what's best for him. And I thought that was a pretty mature take from a young man who, for lack of better words, had to do a lot of growing up in his life and being the adult, and just in terms of his personal life. And so for a guy like Richard Anderson to say that, he, talked about, he said, I asked him, the second question was, how do you think that affects, this 2026 class? And he said, I don't know if it does, because we can be Louisiana heavy. He used that quote, and we can be really good. And look, Glenn, you're from the state. I'm not. I think one thing I've learned living here is that there is a sense of pride about high school football here. There's a sense of pride in being from the boot and being able to represent and wear the purple and gold. And I think sometimes fans, and this is just my opinion, can get caught up in that, where maybe there are better prospects outside of it. But in this 2026 class, like, I think Richard Anderson was pretty almost spot on. Like, there's some real playmakers in this class to where you could build the core, the nucleus of this class out of 2026, and go add around the edges elsewhere. And look, there's some big time targets in Texas and Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi where LSU could go and get some guys, but maybe 2026 more than others. And I'd be curious for some of the listeners and viewers and board members to kind of go back and see, when was the last year where LSU really dove into Louisiana and it paid off. And I mean that in the sense of, like, guys stayed, they developed, became NFL players, maybe won a championship. So
Yeah.
I really kind of going back to Anderson's answer and answering yours as well. I think so. Like, I think it starts at the forefront with a guy like Frank Wilson, and just what he's able to, the pull that he has in this state, the relationships. And man, one thing I keep hearing, and I was talking with Jamar Owens today, and I'll have that piece on Thursday morning, is not just, we heard this a lot last year, the energy level of Blake Baker, but it seeming has turned in now to just keeping it real. And we hear a lot of that with Corey Raymond. We hear a lot of it with Blake Baker. Kevin Peoples has been thrown around in that same conversation. And even Cortez Hankton. I was talking with Xavier McDonald, a big receiver prospect. And Glenn, I feel like every single time we talk about a receiver recruit, like, another one pops up. We're like, yeah, this board could be 40 names long of where LSU could want to go at the receiver spot. So all that to say is, I feel like the feedback is this staff is very real about what they're trying to do. And look, they can't take 40 kids. And so when you read our recruiting updates or you read interviews, you also have to understand that every single kid that says they love it is not going to be able to make an OV, not going to be able to have that opportunity. So I just think in general, this staff's doing a good job of laying the foundation with these kids. And I'll say this too, and I think for some people this will fall on deaf ears because of just the frustration with where our sport that we all love is gone. But relationships do still matter, and they still do carry weight. And does it carry as much weight? Is the pie sliced differently now that NIL is so prevalent? Yeah, I'll give you that. And LSU fans, more than anybody, have been victim to that type of stuff. With obviously with what happened last year with Bryce Underwood. But it still matters. And so when kids come onto campus, like for example, when Booby Feaster comes onto campus this week, his bond with Cortez Hankton is going to matter. It's not just what does the check say. And it's not just that. And that will that play a role? Yeah, Feaster's going to be one of the top guys, the top players at his position by the time the class rankings are officially final. So I just think that they're doing a good job building relationships. I think guys are hearing what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. I've had several guys say that to me, whether they like it or not, and they can appreciate that. Whether LSU says, "Hey, we like you, we need to see more," or "We like you, we want you now," type of thing. And so I think those kind of conversations are needed, and it seems like the Tigers staff, multiple guys, and I listed them off, are willing to have those. And I think in today's day and age of college football, with money being so prevalent, NIL, you kind of need that. You need coaches to say, look, we think you need to develop. We think that we need to see more, or this is, we need you now, and we think you are our guy now. And so I like that. That was kind of the sense I got this weekend, and I'm sure I'll get more, or I got last weekend. I'm sure I'll get more of this weekend, and just throughout the week of talking with guys as well, because it's an important class. I mean, every class is important, Glenn, but I think this one's really, really important in terms of the future of Brian Kelly, because if on the field results aren't going where they fans really, really want them to go, you've often in years been able to fall back on a high level recruiting class, right? And so you need another one of those as kind of your safety net in case the Tigers don't make the playoffs here in 2025.
Well, I think it's important, and I can't really I can't really add on to anything you just said. I think you summed it up really nicely. To be honest with you, but in terms of the importance of this class, I think what makes it so important is the fact that there are positions of real need here where Louisiana is stronger this year. I mean,
Yeah.
how long have we been hammering? When are they going to get the defensive line on the interior handled? Well, you've got several prospects here in the state in this class that you could really use and could really help. I think at an early stage of their career, you've got two safeties, Blaine Bradford and Aiden Hall, who I think are two of the best safeties in the country. And if you lock them up, that's a real good look for your safety group going forward. I mean, just real nice. You talk about offensive linemen and Bryson Martinez, and he's a top 10 player at his position. They've got receivers, whether it's Jabari Mack or Kenny Darby. I think that there are positions here where LSU can really help the future of their of their program that are
Mm-hmm.
of immediate need. And I
Yeah.
mentioned two wide receivers there, but when you look at the wide receiver room right now, I mean, you could potentially be losing a good chunk of this group after 2025. When you look at Chris Hilton and you look at all these older guys like a Barian Brown, who they just brought in from the portal. Nick Anderson, if he has a big year, is probably off to the NFL and will make a bunch of money if they have the kind of year that they want. So if he has the kind of year that he wants. So there are a couple of positions here when you look at the future, and Brian Kelly talks so much about pulling the base of the state that could really help this class, which is why it's so important for all those coaches on that staff to be kind of in lockstep unison to making sure that they get as many of them as possible and as many of them that they want out of this state before, like you mentioned, branching out and going to fill needs at other places.
I did want to, before we wrap up here, because you did mention a couple of names in that 2026 class, especially inside the state. Just some names that I was pretty impressed with. And by the way, Aiden Hall and Richard Anderson both said, and obviously if you've read the stuff and just kind of seen the public reports now, have kind of locked down. Like they're not taking visits anywhere else. Aiden Hall especially said, I'm done. Like I'm not taking an OV anywhere. Like LSU's where I'm going to be. I'm ready to, I'll take my OV to LSU, take the pictures, let the family enjoy the trip to Baton Rouge, and then pretty much I'm going to get ready to play my senior season and enroll. And I think that's
Great to
music.
hear. That's
Yeah,
great to
that's
hear.
music to LSU fans' ears, especially what you just talked about. If now you can really focus on Blaine Bradford, like that's who you don't have to worry. Well, you always have to worry, right? But you don't. But essentially, right now, you don't have to worry. But a couple of the names that I really liked, and I think were just kind of interesting. Hayward Howard Jr., the cornerback, 6'2", 175, out of Edna Carr, Glenn. He won MVP for the camp for his position group. And you look at that frame, LSU has not offered yet, but we know the Tigers are hesitant to offer in state because they want to keep relationships, and they got to make sure they really want him. 6'2", 175 kind of fits the prototype of what Corey Raymond likes. And so I would not be floored if they get him on campus before, I'll say this, before the summer's over and he's at least got an offer. Like that wouldn't floor me. He looked really good, real fluid out there. And I mean, Glenn, look, I know they've recruited the cornerback position, but you got to stack some really good classes. And I think Howard has some good potential. And then on the other side, and I think it's always really intriguing, right? Because Frank Wilson is very picky about the running back position, and you just kind of did really really well within the state. But Alvin Celestin out of Terrebonne High School there in Homa, uh, look, he has some jets. He's got some burners. He's only 5'8", 155 pounds, but the guy, man, they threw to him out of the backfield and he had some one-on-one opportunities. And yeah, I know that one-on-one favors the offense, but Glenn, he made some guys miss. And so, LSU's obviously got some feelers out in terms of what they're maybe doing outside of the state. I know they offered the kid from Texas, and his name's escaping me here recently. But always keep an eye on guys like that too, because I think it's interesting as well. So that's just a couple of those in-state prospects, and also throw Roderick Tizino in there too, who I'll get a chance to see out of Opelousas Catholic School. I'll get a chance to see him this weekend as well in the Battle 7-on-7 tournament. So, man, I think Glenn, perfectly kind of talked about it and summed it up here today. Is spring ball's back, spring recruiting's in full swing, and man, baseball is embarking on SEC play in a much favorable opening weekend series than they did last year. I think that's the best way to put it. I'm not going to put any expectations on the weekend, but you kind of feel good about what you're doing.
Yeah, it's nicer to ease into a schedule like this with Missouri, and I haven't done my deep dive into Missouri yet. They could be world beaters for all I know, but they definitely appear to be the kind of the easier schedule as opposed to starting off with Tennessee and Arkansas and A&M like they did last year, which was just a brutal stretch. And they got to play those three teams in a row again this year, but it's a little bit later in the schedule, and you should be hitting your stride. So, yeah, very excited about the SEC schedule here with this baseball team. I think they're playing some really good baseball right now. You got a chance to see them hang 17 runs on three innings. I mean, I bet that was a long 2 hours. So it's an exciting time, and a lot of these sports now are going to kind of cross over, whether it's spring football and baseball, and certainly recruiting. Basketball should be winding down here as early as Wednesday night, but pretty soon, starting the 22nd of March, transfer portal opens up, and we'll have some off-season basketball content to keep you all informed on as Matt McMahon tries to get this thing righted on a better path. And so we'll see kind of what that looks like as well.
It's all more reason for you to subscribe to the Go 24/7 site. We can find that link down below for all the written and digital content as well over here on the YouTube channel that you get for free as well. But come hang out with us on the message boards. It's a fun time and not a better time to do it. Look, spring, like Glenn said, there's so much crossover, baseball, football, basketball, you don't want to miss. And to not leave them out, the women's basketball team will find out where they're headed potentially. I mean, obviously they got to win the first round that'll be hosted in Baton Rouge, but it's going to be Spokane, Washington, or Birmingham, Alabama. Two very different places that they could potentially go. So it'll be interesting.
I bet most of the local media wishes it's in Spokane, Washington. Yes. they want to make that trip up to Washington for sure.
There you go. I agree. I agree. LSU Tigers spring practice, spring recruiting. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like this video. Let us know your comments down below. What you think about the Tigers? What do they need to work on in spring? And what do you want to see come out of spring practice and the spring event/game that'll happen later in April? He is Glen West. My name is Bryce Koon. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.